Hello, I'm W.T. Edmondson, and welcome to Focus. Freedom often causes unbelievable silence. This show continues our focus on the church and the role it plays in society for social change. As I researched the topic, I came across numerous views and ideas as to what the role of the black church is and should be. I was blessed to come across a piece written by Brad Braxton, and the piece was entitled, "The Holy Spirit, Jesus, and Social Justice in the Black Church, Making Noise or Making a Difference." I believe this conversation is important in light of the role the black church has played coming out of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, and those issues taking place today. The current climate of racial tension, police and political violence, distrust of societal and governmental institutions is reminiscent of the time that this country has been and where it is today. I have observed our guests as they have spoken to the need of the better angel against those who speak against society and what is best for the community. Both these men are men of the cloth. Their public positions on the racial climate here in Jefferson City speak to their character, their integrity, and their commitment to justice and equality. I extended an invitation for them to come and engage in a conversation about the role of the black church. So our guest today is the Reverend Adrian Hendricks. He's the pastor of the Joshua House Church, and Reverend John Nelson, he's the pastor of Soma Community Church here in Jefferson City also. Welcome to Focus, and thank you for accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having us.
The black church has always been a hotbed of political activity, whether it's campaigning for civil rights, against gun violence, or police brutality. But the black church is having to adapt to a changing political environment with young activists who hold liberal views such as gay marriage and other issues that the standard, stable church, as I would say maybe, may not cotton to quite well. Manny Otiko authored a piece entitled "The Black Church Struggling to Adapt to New Generation of More Liberal, Less Religious Activists." Said the black church is no longer the central organizing hub it was during the civil rights era. Writer Adele Banks said 50 years after the civil rights activists marched across the South, the black church is finding new ways for activism. But often its clergy admits they are not the leaders, and their sanctuaries are no longer ground zero for the civil rights movement. As we engage in this conversation, I invite you to be candid in sharing your true feelings and views about this topic. Both of you planted your own church here in Jefferson City, so I would think that it would may be a little bit easier for you to set the tone of your congregations. The topic of this conversation is the role of the black church and how you go about addressing social justice issues today, addressing racism, white supremacy, political disenfranchisement, economic disparities, and self-determination. But before we get into the question part of the interview, at least the conversation, tell us a little bit about yourself, the environment in which you were raised, why you agreed to engage in this conversation on the black church.
Well, thank you once again, WT, for having me on your show. I was born in East St. Louis, Illinois. 1975, which is coming right out of the civil rights era of the 1960s. East St. Louis as a city has been going through economic, racial change over the last 25 years. And so that was my basis. I went to an all-black school. I was in an all-black community, although it was poor. And for the most part, all of the relationships that I had were black. A few years after, when my mother decided to go to school and to pursue her MD, we were in Carbondale, Illinois. And so that started to shape my background. And so I go from an all-black community into an all predominantly white community, a Southern Illinois white community, which was a very racially biased, segregated, and in some ways very mean community. And so growing up in my childhood, I had interaction with children who were the sons and daughters of the Grand Dragon for the Ku Klux Klan. So you know, when you've had fist fights with kids who were grown up and groomed in hatred and in a racially based hatred, it shapes your experiences. Moving from there to from Carbondale to Springfield, Illinois, again, another community that was highly racially divisive. We had skinheads that went to our school right along with gangbangers and the whole nine. And so that mix and that mixture, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, when gang violence was at an epidemic in our country, I was not only dealing with that aspect of black-on-black violence and the idea of what it is to be black in mid-America, in the Midwest, but then also we were involved with skinheads and Aryan Nation, white supremacy on that note. And those things shaped and continue to cultivate an idea about what racism was for me. I've had bottles thrown at me at the bus stop. I've had people, we were poor kids, and so they would take Pepsi cans and turn them and shake them up so that when they hit you with it, it would cut your face. Me and my sister had been called out of our names and set up so many times. Again, I'm amazed that I don't dislike white folks. One of my very best friends from childhood was a white brother, Greg, and so these kinds of experiences have always been present in my life, but it has forged a way for me to not only deal with the obvious racism, but then the subtle forms of racism, which is a lot of times for young people in the classroom. And so the school teacher that doesn't give you the kind of attention that you need to be educated, or to be already stereotyped in such a way that you're not developing in your education the way that you should, or the idea that you cannot develop or you cannot think well. And so all of those kinds of experiences I've had, which have shaped my view on the need to be engaged in solving racial issues and being at the table when it comes down to racial conversations. Because again, if we are not going to be involved in the solution, if we're not going to be involved in building collaboration and building relationships, we will be stuck. And our country, our world cannot afford to be stuck. There's too many people dying, and so we have to be engaged. And that's really how I formed some of my idea about why we should be at the table, and why, if there was no table, why you still should speak.
Well, thank you again, WT, for having us here. The reason that I took the invite is based off of very similar to Reverend here, my history. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, in the Kansas City metro area. People ask me where in Kansas City, I always say yes, because I've lived literally all over Kansas City. From going to seminary up north, living out in the country in Baling Hay, where I was one of 3 black kids in the whole school. I grew up going to an inner city missionary Baptist church, Palestine Missionary Baptist Church, where my Sunday school class was next to a crack house. I grew up at the Don Bosco centers downtown, been through the drive-bys. My mom worked at HUD downtown. And so I grew up very similar to you, Reverend, in that I experienced both cultures, but on a regular basis. A unique part of my experience is my dad is Jamaican, and so I would spend my summers in Jamaica, in a third world country, which always made me very happy to come back to the United States. I didn't have to, when I come to the U.S., I could turn on a faucet and get water. Where I lived in Jamaica at the time, we had to go down the hill to get water, and we carried it up on our heads, or washing stuff on rocks, or squeezing potatoes for starch. And so those things really shaped me, because spending my summers in a third world country gave me a flavor for the United States of what it could be. My father told me something when I was younger, because I remember asking him, seeing him go through so many racist things come against him in our community that we grew up in, and asking him why this country? At all the countries, you're Jamaicans, that means you have a British passport. You can go anywhere in the world. Why here? And he said the thing that he's always loved about America is that America has an idea and her reality. And every generation, she steps it closer to putting those two together. That has always stuck with me. As I grew, I went to Kansas State University, where I intended for my undergrad. And there I really joined the BSU and discovered, in a lot of ways, my blackness, my history. And as I started digging into it more and more, I realized that the moral authority of the church is where historically this nation has been able to step forward historically to getting closer between her ideal, which she stated in the Constitution, and where she actually is. And over, it's been people like William Wilberforce, or even somebody as simple as Martin Luther King, which we all know, that drew us closer to that. And so I became a Christian when I was 22, right after I left Kansas State. When I became a Christ follower, I really started on this idea of figuring out ethnic reconciliation. I say ethnic because biblically there is no thing as race. It's kainos or ethnos, which is all tribes, tongues, and nations. And so biblically, I want to look at what does God see and how do we draw them to his original design. And that's what every single Christ follower moving forward has done. But in order to do that as a church, we have to recapture our moral authority, which I think we've lost in many ways. And so when I look over at my life, I see how God has shaped me from growing up in a white community, going to a black church, going to different diverse high schools and working all over. But all of those drew me together into who I am. And so as I grew, I actually never dated any person outside of my race until I got married. And so I married a white girl. We have mixed babies. And we decided when we planted our church that we'll make a church that looks like our family. And really, structurally, in every single way, try to war against this idea of separation of the two. Martin Luther King said in '63, and it's still true today, that the most segregated time and segregated place in the United States is church on a Sunday morning. That has to change. That's where we lose our moral authority.
Well, thank you. Can you recall when you first encountered and understood what racism was, and what was your response?
Absolutely. You know, to have an experience with racism that's personal, it stains you in a way that you'll never forget. And so one of the memories that I have is living in Springfield, Illinois, and even prior to that, but one of the most dominant thoughts in my mind is I was jumped by some white guys. I was in the 6th grade about that time. I'm a little guy. I was always a little guy. I got big when I got in college, but I was always a little guy, and so scrappy but small. And so I was jumped by some high school kids, and three of the guys, it was 3 guys, they were juniors and seniors, held me down on the ground and put their foot on my chest, and of course they were calling me the N-word and spitting in my face. And something like that will never, ever leave my mind. It has formed my hatred for bullies. You know, I have a problem with those who bully the weak. But what it has caused in me is to have an empathy for people who can't fight for themselves and people who don't have a voice for themselves, to be powerless and to feel powerless in any situation. I can testify. I know what that feels like, and I have an issue with systems that create spaces for people to feel powerless. And so we have to respond to systems that overtly express power over, and they don't give power with and power to or power through. And so for me, it has definitely given me some ambition and some motive to see equity and to see justice. And so those things have always been a part of my life, like I said earlier, to have an experience with the Ku Klux Klan so clearly at a young age. And you know, this wasn't a one-time, this was several days. My father had to get involved. This was an issue. And the school that I was in didn't protect me. Now, I didn't see that as a young person. I see that now as an adult, all the different systems that failed to intervene, the systems of community that failed to speak up, all those who watched every day as we were dealing with a racial issue, being isolated and then being punished for our skin. And so those kind of things definitely have motivated us.
Mine distinctly happened when I was in second grade. That's the one that I remember. My mother has told me that there were some before that, but I had a school teacher, I won't name her here, but I had a school teacher who, I was the only black kid in her class, the only one she had had in years, and did not want me there, and made it extremely clear. It was also the time, I have contacts on today, but I wear glasses, that I started losing my eyesight, and I would regularly complain. I would come home and my mother would always say, "Where are your spelling words? Why are you not doing well?" And I would say, "I can't see." She would always put me in the back corner of the classroom, and I became disruptive, as any kid who is not able to get the help that he needed became disruptive in class. And so her solution was to put me in the front of the class, in front of all the kids, not facing the chalkboard, so I really couldn't see anything. And the day that my mother came to the class, I've never seen her act that way since. Ms. Lopresti had me out in the hall with my nose and toes against the wall. Again, as a child, I just thought it was because I was being bad. I heard her go into this classroom and dress down this woman in a way I've never heard her do, or never heard her do since. And apparently she leveled some words against me that I did not hear, but it was the first time I ever heard somebody call me the N-word that I remember. And it stuck to me. And that was the same age as my little boy is today. And I'll never forget that. And she demanded that I be taken out of the school, and we went all the way through the school. Still didn't take me out of the classroom. I finished my year in that classroom with that woman. I'll never forget that, and that shaped me. That thoroughly shaped me. And I've had many times after that, but that was the first time that it really stuck in my head.
Braxton, in his piece, posed a provocative question. He made the statement, he said, more than a decade after initially raising the question about the black church, he was troubled. Are the church simply making noise but not making a difference? Looking at this statement from a macro perspective, is the black church in this generation making a difference in the key issues of the day?
You know, that's a loaded statement. I think it has some assumptions that we would have to clarify. But for me, I would have to give space to the purpose of the church. And the purpose of the church is salvation. And so the priority of the church is to see the lives of people saved from a condition of sin. And so if that's the context, then our job and our assignment is clear. Now, there are other issues that must be dealt with when we bring humaneness into the conversation. And so one of the things I've always thought, the problem that we have in our world now is that people have been dehumanized. This is dehumanization. You don't see my worth. You don't see that I am one like you. We're not equal in that same frame. And so it's easier to be oppressive. And so when I think about the church and the church's role as a priority of salvation is clear. But then there are some other things that I think that the church has to choose its position based on the biblical context. And so there are some areas that the church cannot agree and will not agree with the agenda of whatever the society is pushing forward. And wherever we are informed to agree is because there is a biblical context that we find agreement. And so to me, that's really where there's a distinction between being a social change organization or just being an organization that's involved in injustice or poverty or whatever, as to being the church acting in the way of Christ. What I also find interesting is the model is clear. Jesus was a liberator. Jesus was one to deal with the economic issues of his people. Jesus was one who dealt with the oppressive issues of the Roman Catholics and oppression of the people. Jesus was the one who was giving voice to healthcare issues for people who could not afford healthcare. And so the kingdom brings forth an entire idea of everything that you need being satisfied in God. And so to me, that's where we do have some freedom to really take on some of these other issues that have allowed oppression, and then to have a clear voice that we need to be involved in the elimination of that oppression.
I think when you look at the church as a whole, you have to understand, go back to what he said, the church is about the gospel. And what happens so many times is my white brothers and sisters, my black and brown brothers and sisters, sometimes we get caught up in this idea that we're making a lot of noise because that's not a gospel issue, but it is. The gospel issue is so much more. You see, when we talk about, when in our church, when we talk about reclaiming God's design, it's not just his design that everybody be saved, it's everything. It's the perfect earth. It's everything being set to right. And so making sure that we understand what it actually is, that's a justice thing. We serve a God of justice. So to not be people that are of justice, then we miss the boat. And what's happened over the last, let's say, 30 years or so is evangelicalism as a name has been hijacked by the religious right. And unfortunately, because it's been hijacked, that there are some things that I, as a Christ follower, can not agree with when it comes to Republicans and or Democrats. Because one, they're both building their own kingdom, and it's not God's kingdom. So there are things I automatically disagree with them. And because of that, we have to speak truth to power in all ways. And so when you go back to Dr. King, he didn't speak to conservatives and he didn't speak to liberals, both which marched and both which did not like him. We kind of live in this chronological snobbery when we think that it was all kumbaya when we look back at Martin Luther King, but it's not.
Right, absolutely.
They did not like him at all. And so when we look back on it, we have to understand that we have to regain our moral authority and be able to speak with a prophetic voice into a culture in a way that people may not like, but that's okay. I'm willing to lose my reputation for the gospel of Jesus Christ. The second thing that we miss is this, and I grew up in this system where everybody tells me that racism is over. And what's happened is, especially in middle-class America, we've bought the lie. We have bought the lie. I tell all of my white friends that I love them to death, but I tell them, do not tell me you're colorblind, because you're not seeing me for who God made me to be. God made me as a black man. That's okay. See me for that. You see, we are so obsessed with being colorblind that we forget that God asked us to be color blessed. And so we need to learn how to be color blessed in the church. And once we do that, then we can begin to move forward and be able to speak truth to power. And we can empower each other to do the things with a prophetic voice in this nation. But until we reclaim those two, we've really lost a lot of ground, and that seeds to the point that this young man was trying to make. But we can get there, and there are people that are trying to get there.
Thank you for those comments. You know, I as I was preparing this for this conversation, I was thinking about where I am and how I came to be where I am. So, you know, I am unapologetically a Jesus Christ and Him crucified preacher with a charge of social justice. It said, Prophet Amos said it best when he said, I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to your melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amos in this text reveals a divine impatience, even intolerance, for the exuberant worship, unconcerned about the social empowerment and the communal well-being of the people. So we're talking about not only faith, but we're also talking about works. Yeah. And what I heard you all say is that you cannot place the church in the position of a civil rights organization. But if you are living your faith, you're going to address some of those same issues. What do you think, how does the church not accept the status quo and at the same time not overstep its bounds?
Well, you know, my pushback to that would be, what boundaries? What areas did the church or did Jesus come not to impact? So every area of human existence and every area of the human experience he came to reclaim and to capture, including our sense of self, including our ability to have good interaction and good relationship and to, you know, share this human experience. And so I think that we have the space and the moral fortitude to speak to every area. Now, do we have the strength? Right? You know, the conversation to me about the church, especially in light of where we were in the 60s and where we are now, we're talking about strength. Does the strength of the church, is the church strong enough to bring a message that will affect change? 20, 30 years ago, if we called a meeting, we would have the attention of the city, the mayor, all those in position, all those in power. You call a meeting now, who's going to show up? You know, and so churches who have a strong foundation in the community and have good influence, they can and do affect change in their communities, states, in their cities. Those churches who don't have that social capital, they are less effective. But you said something, and again, how do we have joy in the midst of other people suffering? That's something. Not only would I think it disturbed Jesus when he walked into communities of poverty. It disturbed it. He sighed, he groaned, he was filled with compassion when he saw injustice, when he saw people hurting, when he saw those things happening. And so for every believer, in my mind, when you see it, you ought to have a response. And you ought to have a response that says, I'm willing. Now, I might not know what to do. I might not have the resources to do. But the ambition to do something should be yours. And we have to own that. And so for me, I'm just saying, every person who has an opportunity to do something somewhere, your charge is to do it and give God the glory.
I think if we're talking about the boundaries of the church, I would agree full-heartedly. There are no boundaries of the church. We've never spoke to the status quo, to answer your first question, in a positive way. I mean, again, go back to Jesus. I know we like to make him whatever we want to make him, but go back to who he was. He was a homeless Jew that was murdered. Let's just really call it what it is. He is the God of the universe. But why was he murdered? Why? He spoke truth to power. He came and said, I'm the king. You can't say that. You came and spoke, hey, give unto Caesar what's Caesar, but give unto God what's God. Well, okay, what do you mean? I mean, even to the point that we call ourselves brothers and sisters in Christ, even to a Roman society, that was anathema. The fact that we would call each other brothers and sisters was a legally binding statement that said, you now have legal bounds to my property upon my death. You see, we've always taken the status quo and said, what does God have to say about it? And see, that's the question that really has to be asked. But when we have a society that says, well, I don't really know that there's a God, or I don't really know if I want to live on that, then my question back to them is, then what does it matter? You're just stardust bumping into stardust. What does any of this really matter? Really, there is no morality at that point. Let's just go on and do what makes you happy and hope it really works for you. But if we're asking what God says, there are no boundaries. There is no status quo but his status quo. Truth is defined by him, not by us. And so we as a church have to get back to the basics. And to go back and we look at the church as a whole, even 20, 30 years ago, 50, 100 years ago, the churches stood on that, even pushing against status quo. And so even go back to the instantiation of our Constitution. And you look at the simple thing of something like separation of church and state. That literally were Christians in Virginia, the Danbury Baptist Association, that said, we do not want the state controlling what we believe. Therefore, you will separate it. Now, I know we flip the script today and say, oh, we got to keep church out of government. That's never been the thing. Go back and read it. Danbury Baptist Association in Virginia spoke to Thomas Jefferson and said, we will not join the Union unless you keep the state out of our business. We've always pushed against the status quo, and there are no bounds for us because we're defined by God's bound, not man's.
You know, one of the things that I think he brings up, again, this idea of what morality is and what it needs to be coming out of a Christian experience. Our morality and our faith informs our moral aptitude. And that should shape culture. And that becomes our social human experience together. One that loves everyone, that accepts everyone, that looks to be friend and be in relation with everyone, that looks to see that you're not hungry, that you are clothed, that you are covered, that you have all the things that makes this experience, unless you become stardust bumping into stardust. But it is to have that space to say, this experience that we have on this earth is unfortunately, is not eternal. You only got so much time. While you're here, let's have the best experience that we have. And if we did that, and if we had that in our society wouldn't have no issue. But again, I go back to my point. Because we don't have that humane look at each other. We have a I am better than you disposition of power. And so we belittle and we oppress and then we enslave and then we control. And that's what we're dealing with right now.
I'm sure you've been in conversations where someone has said, church shouldn't be doing that. The church should get involved in that. The question that I always have is, if not that, then what? So what do you say when you hear those kind of statements?
I generally chuckle when I initially hear it, just from the simple perspective that it comes from a place of personal, moral, and even historical ignorance. And not to be mean to them, but just understanding that we deal as Christ followers with the Imago Dei. We deal with that every person is an image bearer of the Most High God. And because of that, we are now ordained, called, and pushed by Matthew 28 to get into every aspect of everyone's life. That's just the call. And so when somebody goes, church shouldn't get into politics, I always love that one. Church shouldn't get into politics. That's funny. I say, as a black man, we've never had any other place to speak to politics but at church. That has been, so it's very nice to be able to separate, politics and church, and you shouldn't preach politics from the politics, but historically, if you're brown in this country, that's the only place you've had to discuss it. The only place you've ever had to feel like a whole person. The only person the only place for all of these things. And so when you look at the black church historically, to understand it, you have to understand the whole black experience in America. You can't bifurcate the two. And so when people tell me, oh, you shouldn't get involved in that, well, yeah. Now, I will say this, to their point, as pastors, our job is to equip the saints to do the work of Christ. And so one of the things we're really trying to do, and historically, you've seen pastors that are in office that are doing these different things, and it is actually a wonderful heritage within the black community. But what happens a lot of times is it comes all to us. It really comes all to us. They're like, oh, pastor, I tell people in church, don't bring them to me to close the deal. You share the gospel with them. As a Christ follower, we're empowering you to do that. And so the same thing, we want to empower people in our church to run for office, empower people in office to speak in these realms because they have influence in places that I will never have influence. And if they're using that, then they can speak in more places that need truth of God being spoken into. But we have to empower them to do it also. And that's something that we have to augment as the black church. But on the flip side, we have to understand that we have to speak to every aspect of life.
And I think he brings up a beautiful point. First of all, to me, the question of what is church is not pastor. Church is not pastor. Church is a people. It is a people with gifts and talents and all kinds of experiences from every age and every culture, every community, every angle. How do you say church shouldn't be involved in the political process, which is really the place where we make decisions about what we expect in culture, what we expect in community, what we expect in law, and then exclude people who are living in that society and living in that culture, living in that frame from being involved in the discussion? That makes no sense to me. And so for me, absolutely. And so God has gifted us all to have gifts and talents and purpose and reason. And some of the church's purpose and reason, some of those gifts and people are to go and write laws. Some of them are to litigate. Some of them are to be doctors and lawyers. But you have your place. And when you show up, church shows up. And so, of course, the church should be involved in those places. And furthermore, you know, we have this almost psychopathic view of how things are done. And so, for example, the politicians write the law. The law should be the moral standard for society.
Right.
Based on what?
Right.
Based on mostly biblical perspectives. Don't steal. You know, and so when I look, even if you go beyond the Bible, you can take this all the way back to Kemet. You can take this all the way back to societies that predate the biblical book. And they have laws that have ruled the moral condition of what we find humane, what is good for all people. And so, to me, again, there's no separation. There's a green light that says go. Right. Now, maybe the problem is we just hadn't gone well enough or consistent enough, because how do you have a morality outside of moral people? And to me, that's really where, now when you look at that, now you're describing North Korea, and you're describing issues that are happening in the sub-Saharan Africa and in the Middle East, where power and politics have been absent of a moral stance, or a moral stance that is not humane, one that has oppressive fabric woven all the way through. And so we're good and you're not. That's not God.
Right.
Okay, hey, we're going to take a break. We have been talking with the Reverend Adrian Hendricks and Reverend John Nelson. We will be right back.